I was a kid, my first real exposure to fantasy fiction, I would argue, came from two very unlikely sources. The first would be the original Star Wars trilogy, which while is sci-fi, uses many of the tropes and themes that are familiar to fantasy. But in terms of actual fantasy fiction and books, while of course books such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were very important to me in forming my love of fantasy stories, what really captured my imagination for fantasy worlds were often the choose-your-own-adventure books that were hugely popular during the 1980s and 1990s. My school library was filled with them. Oddly, an aspect that I like, in particular in some of these older books, were decades old, and in some, other adventurers would leave hints or warnings scribbled on the pages. It was kind of like playing Dark Souls before Dark Souls was a thing. So you're probably asking, what any of this has to do with Fire and Blood? Well, Fire and Blood, when I was reading it for the first time, really gave me the same vibe these classic choose-your-own-adventure books used to. While the choices you're offered don't drastically change the outcome of the story too much, Fire and Blood is written in such a way to present several conflicting versions of events, with varying degrees of credibility and evidence. It's then up to the reader to look at these differing versions of events, assess the evidence and sources, and construct their own version of the truth and of the story that is being presented. Thus, we are left with a situation wherein the version of Fire and Blood that I read and the version that you read could be drastically different depending on who and what you decide to believe. This concept is at the core of what George R. R. Martin was trying to do with Fire and Blood. I think this aspect of it gets greatly overlooked by many who simply view Fire and Blood as a fictional history book with little true value. Fire and Blood mimics real-world history books in a lot of ways. The way history has been passed down for ages was at first word of mouth. Then that evolved into written sources. When modern historians are trying to construct an accurate picture of events that occurred throughout history, they have to consider all the sources available to them and assess what information most accurately and most likely to be true. But even then, the human factor must be considered. Everybody has their own belief system, and everybody has their own biases, and everyone will construct their own narrative that they believe. In replicating a real-world history book, Fire and Blood uses this concept really well, and as a result, each reader has their own version of events. For me, there are a couple of places in Fire and Blood where this concept of choosing your own narrative really stands out. The most obvious place stands out is of course the Dance of the Dragons. There are several events in the Dance of the Dragons where sources drastically contradict, and it is therefore up to the reader to decide what they believe. Their choice will greatly change the context of the war and how they view certain characters. Off the top of my head, there are two great examples that happen really close to each other that will change how you view Daemon, Rhaenyra and Criston Cole. Firstly, we have the nature of the relationship between Rhaenyra and Daemon that leads to Daemon's banishment. Certain Eustace alleges that Daemon seduced Rhaenyra, taking her maidenhood prior to her 16th name day, and that the two had been found abed by Sir Aric Cargill of the Kingsguard. Sir Eustace's version of events has Rhaenyra expressing her love for Daemon. However, notorious and scandalous fool Mushroom instead claims that Daemon had been providing explicit lessons to the girl in how to seduce her champion, Sir Criston Cole of the Kingsguard, whom the girl was supposedly in love with. This involved the two flying their dragons to remote islands in Blackwater Bay, where Daemon taught Rhaenyra how to kiss and please a man. The important aspect here is that it is not claimed in this testimony that Daemon slept with Rhaenyra. Now, depending on what version of events you believe, changes how you view Daemon and Rhaenyra as characters, while at the same time changes the dynamic of their relationship greatly. Another example of this idea of readers being asked to construct their own narrative can be seen in the relationship between Criston Cole, Rhaenyra and Harwin Strong, and exactly what events transpired. One account of events has Criston Cole trying to convince Rhaenyra to run away and marry him before her wedding to Laenor Velaryon, with Rhaenyra rejecting him, leading to Cole's deep-rooted resentment for Rhaenyra and Harwin, leading him to align himself with Alicent Hightower, only to be compounded further when Rhaenyra begins an affair with Harwin Strong. Counter to that, we have a version of the tale that states that Rhaenyra attempted to seduce Criston Cole, who then spurned her and was deeply offended that she would ask of him to disgrace his Kingsguard vows. This then leads him to align himself with Alicent, and Rhaenyra then seducing Harwin Strong instead. Depending on what sources you side with, depends how you view Rhaenyra and Criston Cole. In Criston's case, you can either view him as the jilted, jealous ex, who's bitter towards Rhaenyra for rejecting him, or a noble knight of the Kingsguard, proud of his devotion to his faith and vows, deeply offended by the advances of Rhaenyra and her actions that followed. This one event almost makes the reader choose what kind of character Criston Cole is in their version of the story, much like you would have to make your own choices in a choose-your-own-adventure book. I was always very excited to see House of the Dragon. Seeing any part of Fire and Blood on screen was something I wanted since the book came out, and well, the Dance of the Dragons was an obvious place to start. However, something that always worried me about the adaptation of the Dance of the Dragons was the writers of the show were going to have to take these moments where the reader chooses their own narrative and make that choice for the viewer of the TV show. Thus, what we are watching in House of the Dragon is the writer's interpretation and choices when it comes to these moments in Fire and Blood. There are some cases where they have tried to blend multiple sources together in some ways, and some where they have been forced to choose narrative. But that is the issue at the heart of adapting a book such as Fire and Blood. Due to the choose-your-own narrative structure, you're never going to please every fan, given each reader will have their own version of Fire and Blood and their own idea of the story. This can both be a good thing and a bad thing. It's good in the sense that it creates a lot of debate and fan interaction online, with people arguing their own interpretations, but at the same time it could alienate viewers whose choices didn't line up with the show. But at the end of the day, I think the showrunners always knew this going in, which is why they did try and blend events. And ultimately, just like any adaptation of a book for TV or film, it's still an interpretation of events from the source material.